Hello, 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 hello. Welcome everybody to another episode of Roundtable Conversations. And today we have an amazing, exciting topic, slightly polarizing these days, the topic of gun control versus gun rights. We have Amanda Willcox, which is a member of the Brady campaign, and we have Maj Toure of Black Guns Matter. Very excited to have this talk today. I want to remind everybody our mission is to spread the art of listening. And in order to facilitate a listening conversation, a roundtable conversation, we have a couple of rules. Everybody, all the participants in the roundtable are equal in importance. One person speaks at a time. When not speaking, members of the roundtable are focused on listening and understanding the other person's points of view. We always add to the common pool of knowledge. We never negate, never argue. So if the other participant says that the sky is purple and I know that the sky is green, rather than saying, I disagree, the other person is wrong, the other person is, God forbid, lacking in some kind of way, I simply say, I think that the sky is green, and let the audience decide which point of view they find more compelling. And the last rule is there's going to be questions, and when we're going to speak according to the question that was asked. And without any further ado, let us hop straight to it. So question number one, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the whole gun debate. Amanda, take it away.
Sure, happy to talk about that. I actually have cared about gun violence and preventing gun violence my whole adult life. I was a financial supporter of Brady campaign and other organizations, advocacy groups working to reduce gun violence. I always thought I was doing it for other people. And then in 2001, my daughter was killed in a rampage shooting in my home county here, Nevada County, California. And after that, I realized I needed to do more than write a check once a year. And I became involved in the grassroots advocacy efforts of the Brady campaign. And in 2005, I became the legislation and policy chair for the California chapters. So I work on enacting gun violence prevention laws in the state of California. I'm in my 15th year of doing that.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm sorry to hear about your loss. Maj.
Yeah, similar. First, I want to say thank you to Amanda for being here. Also, I want to say, my condolences for, your loss. I think that's corny, but it's the same thing or the same reason why I got involved. In my neighborhood, you keep seeing the same people or, the same type of situation, someone dying unnecessarily based on ignorance around a tool. And seeing that, you got to be proactive. You have to do something about it. And, you see negligence with firearms, you see ignorance, you see things that people could, things are preventable. So, and seeing that over time and seeing people go to jail for these reasons, for things that they missing information on, how to lawfully obtain firearms, and seeing people that are escalating things because they don't understand conflict resolution or de-escalation. So for us, it was like, okay, we're traveling around the country already making music, and we're seeing this same thing over and over again. So we kind of have to get, full-time involved in cutting down on some of the trauma that's associated with this ignorance. And that's what we started our campaign around the end of 2015. And that's how I got into this work.
Awesome stuff. Thank you so much. So our first question is going to be the following. Guns are number 12 on the top causes of death in the USA. Mm-hmm. Why is it that this topic is so polarizing? It's crazy. It seems like it's impossible to have a civil conversation about it. If you compare it to, say, the top causes of death, heart disease, cancer, and stroke, or if you even compare it to a comparable cause of death, quantity-wise, such as traffic accidents, why is it that this topic is so polarizing and these other topics you can actually talk about civilly, and it actually seems that a lot of them don't even engender that much interest? Amanda, take it away.
Actually, I find that the issue is not as polarizing as the rhetoric and politics point to. And I find that there's much ground around preventing gun violence. And notice I said preventing gun violence, not gun control. And if the goal is to prevent gun violence, to reduce firearm injury and death, it's hard to find people who disagree with that premise, right? And how can we achieve that? I think that's where the difference lies in what can we do to reduce gun violence and death. So Maj talked about people not knowing the law and responsible gun ownership. I mean, I think that's a very good point. Safe storage of firearms, locking them up when they're not in use, making sure children don't have access to firearms. People at risk in your home, people at risk of suicide that they don't have access can save lives. There's common ground around that. Most people agree that those who have a past history of violence, or because of their past behavior or condition, and are at risk of future acts of violence, should not have access to firearms. There is broad agreement about it when you talk about it. We see a real disconnect between what our politicians in Washington are doing versus what public opinion is on many of these matters. And I think that's a different issue related to campaign finance reform and the power of the gun lobby.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of those sentiments. I think that no one, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody from the gun community or gun culture that's respectfully doing this to say, oh yeah, death is cool. Oh, trauma is fine by me. I think most, firearms owners in America or the world in general are men and women that are saying, this is a tool for an intended purpose, and you need to be responsible with it. No different than, your car or whatever. So I don't think that I think, like you said, mass media presents it as if, if you're a gun owner, you must be like this crazy person that's okay with death. I think when we get into the weeds of the process of respecting someone's right to have the tool that hasn't done the wrong thing with the tool, I think that some people that may be lying on the more outliers or the extreme natures or sides of this conversation that would say that's where some of that friction comes in at, but as far as like someone saying, hey, I think that everyone that has a firearm should secure it properly. They should, be knowledgeable in it. All of these different things. I think that's a general culture question that, our organization does, again, tying into other things. So you can't get to a firearm before you've had an understanding of the basic rules of firearm safety at our events. You can't go into this like it's a game. It's not a game. So I think that the commonality is there. I think that where the differences may tend to happen is in the process of how we're executing the things that we agree on, and making sure that we're not mandating things for people's personal property or their personal rights, making more and more government be the thing. I think, the vast majority of people are agreeing that firearms are a part of American history, a part of American culture. And if you're going to participate in that, with each, with great power comes great responsibility, So I think there's commonality there, but I think some people in mainstream media like sensationalizing things for their own agenda of chaos.
Thanks so much to both of you. So you both talked about the agreement that some people should have access to guns, some people shouldn't. So that brings me up to our next question is, should everyone have access to guns? Who should we restrict from having access to guns? You both mentioned criminality. What about people who are depressed? What about people who are on SSRIs? What about people who are aging and might be at risk for dementia and for vision problems, etc.? Who do you think should have access to guns, and who do you think shouldn't? Amanda, please.
As I said earlier, I think people who, based on their past behavior or condition, my phone's ringing, who are considered at risk, should not have future acts of violence should not have access to firearms, and that should be data driven. And we know that the biggest predictor of future acts of violence is past acts of violence. That, I think the research is very clear on that, and that's why people in California, for example, people who have committed violent misdemeanors are prohibited from purchasing a gun for 10 years, prohibited from purchasing or possessing for 10 years. That's stronger than federal law, but that's based on the research and evidence that a history of violence or violent misdemeanors is a predictor of future acts of violence. We know alcohol abuse is a big predictor of future acts of violence. For example, someone who's had multiple DUIs within a short period of time, that person is at greater risk of violence, more likely to commit firearm violence, and more likely to misuse the firearms or store it improperly. So that's another research-based or evidence-based recommendation on who should be prohibited from having guns. I think there's broad agreement that young children shouldn't have access to firearms, right? I think where there is more confusion, and I think this is where the politics gets in, is people with mental health issues. And the gun lobby likes to say it's not about guns, it's just about mental illness. People with mental illness actually are not violent than society as a whole. If we removed all guns from people with a diagnosed mental health condition, we would drop our gun death rate very, very little. I think that's too broad of a brush, but there are people who are at risk because of their mental health condition or because of a emotional or situational crisis. For example, someone may be suicidal and despondent because their spouse died. They lost their job, right? They might have heightened anger at their boss that fired them, heightened anger at a neighbor over a dog barking, whatever it is. And so there are the situational, emotional times where a person's in crisis and at risk. And one of the policies moving forward all over the country right now is very temporary firearm prohibitions during that time of crisis when the person is at particular risk of gun violence.
Thank you, Amanda.
Sure. For me, who I think should be people that should not have firearms, or people that have proven a danger to themselves. If they're, like, we already have a rule that's, if you've been mentally adjudicated, you don't have access to firearms. That's already a rule. People that have committed, if we're talking about the people that are already prohibited from having firearms, those people are already on the list. People that have committed violent crimes, people that are in possession of things, Schedule 1, whatever substances that have been deemed prohibiting, substances. So I think everyone agrees there. I think where we're getting into the weeds of the conversation of, I think it's very important that we don't start saying what people may do in the future. I think that is a very, it's a very Gestapo-ish type of tactic. We've seen that happen before in American history and world history. I think that when we start telling somebody, oh, well, you did this in the past, me as a reformed scumbag myself, I know the importance and the power of taking a second chance or giving someone the opportunity. I also think that if someone's debt to society has been paid for the actions that they've made, I think that it's very important that we at least mentally allow them the opportunity to better themselves. So I'm always leery of saying things like, we have a predictor of what someone will do in the future. None of us has a 100% accurate crystal ball. None of us. None of us are God. None of us can tell the future. None of us, I think when we start going that direction, we're in a minority report or a Orwellian type of scenario where we're determining, who has a certain thing or who doesn't, but we're also determining that not based on their job description, because we're talking about alcoholism. A lot of law enforcement officers have alcohol problems. That's more data, So my thing there is maintaining the people that have done things, and while they're in jail, obviously there's no guns in jail, but at the same time, I think it's a slippery slope to say because someone did a thing in the past, or if someone just insinuates that you might be, as we're seeing these they're calling them temporary, scenarios where they come in and take firearms. Those are violations of personal property rights. And I think that someone can just say you did something with no actual proof, no due process. And I don't think those things are very American. So I think there's a thin line there where we're telling someone that, we know what you're going to do in the future. And none of us are, are God.
So, I'd be happy to debate, but no, you don't want that.
We can do a second round about this. You guys want to do a second round about it? Amanda?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you raise interesting points because I've I very much believe in the idea of redemption and, people who, for example, people who have served their time, in a sense, paid their debt and are back in society. I absolutely want to, restore voting rights. All the problems with having a record that interfere with assimilating back into society, I think is a real problem. So, I think on that sense, we're on the same page. I think the problem I have in terms of firearms and firearm ownership is the public safety risk involved. And here I do feel that, of course, we never know a person's future acts. But I think if we need to look at the evidence and the aggregate of the data, and the aggregate of the data shows that people with certain past behaviors are more likely at future acts of violence. And so I think that is evidence driven. In terms of temporary firearm prohibitions, like I mentioned about people in a situational emotional crisis, these laws that have been recently passed and are moving forward in other states, there is a due process involved. There's a noticed hearing within a very short period of time. It's the same as a parent, a child being removed from a parent because the child is at risk by being with the parent. That can be done if a judge is involved, if there's a notice hearing in a very short period of time. And with guns, all those laws out there with the temporary firearm prohibition, the gun violence extreme risk protective order we're calling, it's not longer than 21 days max. And my contention is you can always give a gun back, but you can't give a life back.
So yeah, that sounds cool, but again, still, there's the due processes, and I don't want someone to insinuate or say I did something. The example that was given as far as a child, there's proof and evidence of the child actually being assaulted or violated and things of that nature, and that goes through a process, not in a very short period of time. I think that when we rush to make judgments, for example, as someone who's been lied upon, I'm a person that has been lied on about something as heinous as rape. Fortunately, I had due process, and that court process took some time to sift through the data, and it wasn't a very short process, and I don't think we need a very short process for something like that, as something as serious as violating someone's human right to defend their life because of an accusation. I think that due process is a process. I don't think it's a due rush. And I think a lot of these extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws do just that. They, like you just said, they rush through the process. And on top of that, I think it's based and rooted. The concept of due process isn't someone said something, so we're taking your property until we figure it out. I think President Trump made that same exact statement, and he was wrong when he said it. Take the guns first and worry about due process later. That is not an American way. There's a reason why we have systems of checks and balances, and everyone is supposedly presumed innocent until shown to be guilty. I think that because it's around such a serious thing as a firearm, I think that there's a lot of emotional reactions to it. And I think that, from my perspective, it's even a little bit more disheartening because of the fact that I want to sift through the guys and the women that actually shouldn't have a firearm. I don't want somebody that's mentally unstable, proven to be mentally unstable, to have that firearm. But if we're throwing that title at every single person, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get the actual guys.
Thank you, guys. I want to move to the next question. And the next question is, should we ban guns? Should we ban some guns? Is the freedom to own guns unlimited? What is the criteria to which guns should be legal or shouldn't be? I know there was a law passed in '86, if I'm not mistaken, about automatic rifles and such. I know I can't buy an RPG. What do you feel that should be the limit to the type of firearm that's accessible to the public, Amanda?
Okay, I'm always first, huh? That's fine. The Brady campaign has never advocated for a ban on firearm ownership. Polling after polling in our country has shown that large majorities of Americans support quote unquote gun control, but oppose a gun ban. That's where the public is on it. And the Heller decision in, when was that, 2008, though that broke years of precedence in terms of fighting for a right to own a gun in the home, I think it does, in a sense, match where our public opinion is on the issue. The Heller decision, which found for a right to own an operable handgun in the home was for self-defense, was actually a very narrow finding. And Scalia, a conservative judge who wrote the opinion, said that that right's not absolute, that certain classes of people can be prohibited from owning firearms. Firearms can be prohibited in certain sensitive places like schools, courthouses, and particularly dangerous weapons can be prohibited, and the commerce or sale of guns can be regulated. So that decision kind of matched, I think, public opinion and the reality of where we are in terms of many of our laws, particularly in California. So in terms of particular weapons, I think it's most dangerous to keep weapons out of, most important to keep weapons out of dangerous hands, all weapons from dangerous hands, rather than certain weapons from everybody. That said, I think high-powered, semi-automatic weapons, particularly those that have military features that help maintain aim and control while they're firing, and the rapid reload, particularly of large capacity magazines, these are indeed military-style weapons that I believe do not have a place on the streets of a civilized society. You know, when the Second Amendment was written, that's when people had muskets, you know, and it took 5 minutes or whatever to load them. There was not that kind of firepower back in the 1700s.
So I kind of want to touch on, as a gun owner, as a gun historian, that last part is a little bit historically inaccurate. The puckle gun existed, which was full auto in the 1700s. You know, among other firearms, you know, from antiquity. You got Gatling guns, you got all of these different things that, you know, existed a long time ago. So that's one. The other thing is when people say, you know, because the question is, what firearms, you know, should we ban? Currently, fully automatic firearms are fully legal in America. The Gun Control Act, which you're talking about, is when they were put into a space where you have to fill out a different form of paperwork to purchase these, and you have to get a tax stamp for these particular full auto firearms. They're almost effectively banned because of the fact that they cannot be produced unless you have a different license. And so because the supply is limited, the price of those firearms are extremely high, sometimes $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for one gun. So yeah, those things that are not used in, you know, war, or those are the firearms that are not used in a lot of the, you know, the tragedies that we've seen around the country. Now, as far as the labeling of things, weapons of war, so to say a high-powered, all firearms, all rounds are high-powered. That's how they work. A projectile from an explosion comes out of a casing. That is high power. And then when you say high-powered semi-automatic, semi-automatics are most modern handguns. Most modern handguns, semi-automatic means one trigger squeeze, one round comes out. The ones that I was talking about earlier, fully automatic means as you hold the trigger down, more rounds come out. Which again, those are extremely expensive that the general public, for the most part, don't own. Even though it's fully, you know, lawful to purchase those if you can afford them. So I think that there's a lot of misnomers there. Those misnomers are spaces that, you know, a lot of misinformation continues to breed because not enough people from the gun community are willing to give information about the science of firearms to people that have experienced trauma. And that's what I think these types of conversations are very, you know, good at, and getting rid of a lot of the ignorance that's clearly there. And at the same time, having a respect for the trauma while cutting down on, you know, negative and ignorance and things like that.
So this brings me to our next conversation. There seems to be a lot of confusion and misinformation and just a general lack of clarity about what exactly is an automatic rifle, what's an assault rifle, what's an automatic assault rifle, automatic semi-assault rifle. Can you explain Uh, First of all, why is there so much confusion about this particular uh, category, and why is there also so much emotion attached to it? It seems to like bring everybody's like worst demons out, like automatic assault. I mean, these are definitely scary names, but what's actually the concrete differences, definitions, and why is this so polarizing? This specific niche, Amanda.
Yeah, well, and you're right about automatic, such as a machine gun, versus semi-automatic. With the semi-automatic, you have to pull the trigger each time for the gun to fire, and it automatically reloads the next bullet in the chamber. I mean, I agree with that. Nonetheless, this can shoot many bullets in a very short period of time, particularly if the gun is has attached a large capacity magazine, and the magazines can easily be exchanged or reloaded, so that continuous fire or near continuous fire can be maintained. And that's what we've seen in many of these mass shootings, where it's a semi-automatic, not a machine gun, but with the ability to rapidly reload and maintain fire. And that's when so many people are killed so very quickly. And I think that's why there's so much concern among the public about it. Now, I've heard the gun lobby say, well, you just don't like these guns because they look scary. And it isn't about looks, it's about function. And as I said earlier, the ability to rapidly reload, maintain fire, and maintain aim and control, with the other quote unquote assault weapon features such as a pistol grip or the folding stock and that kind of thing. And it's that combination that allows so many rounds, again, to be fired so quickly that make them so lethal. Then you have the guns and the kind of bullets with, for example, the AR-15, that the bullets, the damage they do, and many surgeons have testified about this, the damage that these bullets do in the body in terms of how they move around in the body, and basically shred organs. It's far more lethal than from a handgun or something like that. So I think it's because of the injury and the lethality and the number of people that can be shot and killed why it's such a hot button issue for many people. Assault weapon, that's just a loose term that's very nonspecific that I think people who don't like the guns call it. It's, I'm not sure. I think that's in the eye of the beholder, basically.
So I kind of want to go touch back on the concept of a lot of misinformation. So one, AR-15s have standard capacity magazines. Standard capacity magazine for AR-15, as most rifles, most modern rifles, is 30 rounds. So I think the distinction has to be between, is a person talking about a semi-automatic pistol or a semi-automatic rifle. So if we're going to talk about a semi-automatic pistol, my Glock 19 that I have, it has 16 rounds in it, and it's just a handgun. I can get a different magazine. It has more rounds in it. I think some of the misinformation is based on, the thing about the bullets being different and they move around. Two things there. One, first, even before that, I want to say that this is a hot button topic because regardless of what type of round some idiot uses to take life, that's still a trauma. And I think that those idiots should be locked under the jail. I think they should have their due process. I think that they should get the best attorneys that their money can buy them. And I think when they're convicted, they should be locked under the jail. I think what happens is we focus on the velocity, where we're talking about 223, 556. And I think these are numbers that if you're not a shooter, that you don't shoot, that you don't understand the mechanics of rounds, of cartridges, of any of these things, right? If you don't notice, these numbers and these letters seem scary. So they make up terms, just like Amanda just said, you say these things like, not you, but the general public will say assault rifle, not knowing that that does not exist. Or they'll say things like weapon of war, and they'll be identifying it as an AR-15. But AR-15s, one, were not designed for military use. They were designed for civilians, right? And number two, no one takes an AR-15 to war. Most guys that are in the military, they want to take an M4. you know. So saying because military guys have access to, again, to full automatic. So I think there's a lot of misinformation around it. And because there's trauma, because an idiot takes the tool and does the wrong thing with it, and that level of misinformation still exists. AR-15 bullets are no different than the hollow points that I have in my Glock 19 in the sense of their lethality. You can still die from a bullet. I think because there's trauma attached to it, it's a hot button topic. But it's just something that we can handle without mass media presenting such falsehoods. These are scientifically and inaccurate statements made about rounds, bullets, types of guns, and just labeling them irresponsibly to scare Americans. And I don't really think that's fair to the people that have experienced trauma. I don't think it's fair to the people that want to protect their own freedoms and protect themselves from those guys that will wish those types of harm. And I think we just kind of got to do better there in that regard by being more informed before we attack a thing.
Thanks, guys. So this brings me to our next question. Majority of gun deaths are caused by handguns, 65% in 2016, according to my statistics. There's also like, I think 30% isn't really clear. So it's not like all the rest are rifles or whatever. It's just not entirely clear. Why do rifles of various type take up so much of the debate when the majority of the death is caused by handguns? Why this discrepancy between the disproportionate between what actually kills more people and what takes up more of the debate? Amanda, please.
Well, I think because these high-profile, horrific mass shootings have been done with, I won't call them assault weapons because I know better, but have been done with weapons we're just talking about. That's high-powered, semi-automatic with military features, put it that way, with the capability to maintain fire, with magazine size and rapid reload. Most gun violence, and that's what gets the public attention. And horrific circumstances. Everyone, the idea of first graders cowering and being shot at Sandy Hook, and the idea of going to a rock concert in Las Vegas or a country music concert in Las Vegas, or being in a school, or being in a theater in Aurora, Colorado. All those kinds of things, I think, gets the public's attention because they can imagine themselves in those places and that happening. And the victims in that case seem particularly innocent. I would offer all victims are innocent, whether it's from that shooting or happening, on the urban streets in Fresno or Sacramento or Oakland. Maybe not innocent, but no victim deserves to die. So that those capture the attention and the kind of weapon that was used in many of those high profile shootings. The everyday shootings we don't hear about. Most are not covered in the media. And in fact, almost 2/3 of the shootings, I think it's 60% of shootings, are suicide by a firearm. And we certainly don't hear about that. Handguns, it's probably easier to kill oneself with a handgun rather than a rifle, but it's done both ways. I think also around, I'll finish with that. But I think it's because of the high-profile shootings, there's that focus on the rifles and so-called assault weapons as opposed to handguns. You're right that more of the urban crime certainly is committed by handguns.
I think that what Amanda said is certain elements of that are 100% spot on. I think to say hey, gangbangers, because America has made someone that has chosen a different path or had a rougher life, that type of life is not being valued as much. So if those guys kill themselves, they're beyond redemption. I think that part gets left out. And so of course we can't talk about that. We can, but we generally don't. I also think that to have the conversation about 60% of deaths in relation, that's an overwhelming number. 60% are not like victims of violence. And then you got to walk into the stat game. Okay, so if 60% of them are suicides, that means we're underserving Americans from all different urban, suburban, rural, whatever. We're not giving them or making them feel whole. We did a show today talking about there's a boy crisis in America where, boys' suicide rates are going up, so forth and so on. So then if you start digging at that, then you have to get off of the tool of the firearm. The tool is just the reason why they're using that tool is because it's effective, and the trauma or that pain that they're going through, they want it to stop fast, right? So then we look at the tool, but that's kind of like killing the flies and leaving the garbage. And that the unfortunate part about that is there's also another large segment of the American population that has not done the wrong thing with that tool. All right. So then you got to factor in other things like, again, the AR-15 sounds like a scary one. Then you got to factor in the fact that these mass shootings get all of this sensationalized media coverage, but they don't even make up 1% of shootings in America annually. So all of these things are there that if mainstream media, again, we agree, me and Amanda and I agree here that, mainstream media makes it just look a whole lot scarier when it comes to the ones that they've chosen to be, the scary looking firearm. And if you're doing that and not looking at urban America because you don't think urban America matters, you're only going to be left with looking at the rifle in a high profile case.
So you both touched upon the painful issue of suicide. And really, it's almost 60% of gun deaths are suicides. And there is really a lot of conversation going on about that. How should we address the issue of suicide? What interventions can we take in order to lower these numbers? Is it the same kind of tools to address these numbers as we do to address the issue of homicide? And how can we improve the conversation about gun violence in general and specifically about suicide in order to actually address these issues? Amanda, please.
Sure. Well, suicide prevention, of course, one needs to look at that holistically. Why is that kind of despair or despondence? Why is someone suicidal? Training people around them, family members, primary care providers, school personnel about knowing the signs, mental health first aid. I mean, there's many programs and many programs in schools oriented towards making sure that students aren't feeling bullied or disenfranchised and that kind of thing. And obviously all those efforts I support, looking at it holistically. In terms of the tool, and as was said, a firearm is particularly lethal and it's particularly quick. And so if someone has access, if a suicidal person has access to firearms, they are more likely to complete the suicide because the firearm is so lethal. And many, particularly young people who kill themselves, it's very impulsive, where 5 minutes pass maybe between the time they think of suicide and they actually try to commit suicide. And if a gun is not available, I'm confident that lives would be saved. And it's important to remember that those who try to kill themselves and do not succeed, those people generally do not go on to die by suicide later. So if someone tried pills, for example, or in instead of a firearm, they're more likely to survive, and they actually are more likely to not die by suicide later. So it is an important strategy that every suicide prevention expert would say is to remove access to lethal means. That will save lives, and the most lethal way of killing oneself is a firearm. So I think that I hope covers what your question was. I would the only thing I would add to that, this idea that you want a gun you're going to be safer in your home with a gun in the home, that is actually a fallacy because most gun deaths are suicide. Okay, I'll stop now.
I think that, without proper information and training and safety and like, to use the phrase that you used, Amanda used, holistic. If there's not a holistic approach, something as simple as fatherlessness, and so my children are fully aware of firearms. And I'm also on top of before the firearms conversation, I'm also making sure that I'm checking on my children. I'm also making sure that, what's going on in their life. I think we've degraded from a concept of a nuclear family or everyone being involved and us having dinner around the table. I think these are preventative measures. I think that if you know these things and if your firearms are secured properly, that only you as the owner of those firearms have access to until it's time to use those for hunting or shooting or going to the range or whatever activities you have with your children, I think those children don't get access to those firearms anyway, and they shouldn't. So I'm also of the belief that if your child has access to your firearms and you're not around, again, you have your due process and you should get locked under the jail. It's just what it is to me. I think that the question is, in essence, what can we be doing? What can we do to prevent the suicide? And I think that that's not really a conversation about a firearm. Actually, that's more of a conversation of making sure that we're attending to our young people. That, whether they have access to a firearm or not, if you remove the root cause of that person feeling that way, because they feel bullied, they feel depressed, and we're not on that, then it can be, whether it is cutting, whether it is taking pills, whether it is shooting themselves. I think that you're still going to have the outcome of a depressed young person or even an adult. So I think those are more solutions that are oriented with getting to the root cause of the problem, as opposed to dealing with the means of how, this young person, killed themselves.
Thank you to the both of you. So our next question, also something that you both touched upon, the issue of mass shootings. What do you define as a mass shooting? What percentage of or proportion of gun homicide is related to mass shootings? And why do mass shootings seem to take such a big part of the debate compared, for instance, to Latino or Black gang violence and victims of gang violence in inner cities, which actually seem to be the majority of gun homicides? Why are those offered so little a proportion of the debate in comparison to the mass shootings events, just quantity-wise? Why the discrepancy? Why we don't talk about them to the same extent? Amanda.
Yeah, and I remember attending a press conference in California shortly after the Parkland shooting, and legislators, everyone was talking about that shooting, how terrible it was, and their new bill ideas. And I commented in the press conference, we have to remember that same day how many were killed or that 3-day period there was a large number of shootings in Fresno, and how come no one's talking about that? I find it very disturbing, and even not all mass shootings are equal. The ones that get people's attention are the ones that happen to white people in affluent communities. Think Sandy Hook, think Parkland. And that I find very troubling. And I think it's the fact that other affluent white people or white middle-class white people can think that could be my kid, that could be me. And that's why as I said before, I think that's why people respond emotionally to these mass shootings so much, and they seem particularly horrific because they can relate to it. Again, everyone goes to a movie theater, was in first grade or knows a first grader or went to a concert, and can relate to these horrific shootings. So again, they get the attention. They are not the majority of shootings. Sadly, the number of mass shootings seem to be rising. And sadly now, to be more horrific or to get the attention, the number has to be higher. And now when sometimes I read a mass shooting, I think, oh, good, only 8 were killed instead of, the 26, like it happened in Sandy Hook, or the 49 or whatever it was in Las Vegas. So unfortunately, we've kind of changed the bar has been changed on what's a really bad one compared to a normal mass shooting. The definition has actually changed. My daughter's shooting, 3 were killed, 3 others were injured. Because only 3 were killed, only 3, it's now not considered a mass shooting. They raised the number. I think it's now 4 have to be killed or 5 to be considered a mass shooting. But nonetheless, it's lives lost. And we need to care about all lives lost, whether it's these mass shootings or people in our impacted communities, Black and brown people in impacted communities.
Yeah, I agree there. I think that it speaks to the bias that America has traditionally had. And it's unfortunate as an American, the reality of the scenario is, white soccer mom tears tend to trigger the media a lot more. And that speaks to even us as Americans, my white, followers and stuff. That means that, you don't see, your brothers and sisters in urban America, your black and brown people as that could be my child. So it's still through the lens of race. If vast majority of, the shootings in New Orleans, which is actually the murder capital per capita, right? If those homicides are happening there, and, as we've just stated, if white America isn't just as impacted by that, then that means that most of those people feel as if that's not my community. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. Urban America is your community because we're all Americans. So I think that's the reason why. The other reason is I do believe that, okay, maybe Amanda is obviously, because we're agreeing on so many topics here, I think Amanda has a more of a thought process of saving life. I think there's people in the gun control room that are not interested in saving life because they're not looking at certain other data. There's 16 constitutional carry states in America, and they notoriously have much lower violent crimes, notoriously have less women being raped. So I think there's some people in the gun control agenda that have their own agenda, not about saving lives, urban, rural, or suburban. I think their agenda is control. I don't think it's about finding that balance between how we can respect the freedom and the right to bear arms that's stated in our Second Amendment and our Bill of Rights, as well as how can we cut down on trauma. I don't think that that's what their other people's agenda is. I think their agenda is to highlight the things that are sensationalized, to get Americans to agree to voting in policies that are in direct opposition to their own freedoms. So I think those people exist, and it's our job to kind of like weed some of that out of it.
Sadly, we are out of time, though definitely not out of issues to address in this very, very deep issue. I think it was an awesome conversation. I really want to thank the both of you for having a really interesting, I think, in-depth conversation about a topic that is very, very sensitive and very polarizing. And you both were outstanding, I think, as far as promoting the art of listening. You both did a stellar job. I do hope we'll have maybe a chance in the future to revisit it, address some more of the issues that are related to it.
Yes.
I'd love that if both of you have some time in the future. And that you were awesome. Do you guys want to share how people could keep in touch with you or read some of the material that you would recommend or something that you have to say? Amanda?
Sure. Anyone can get in touch with me at cabrady@live.com. It's my email. And go to the Brady campaign actually just changed their name to Brady, or Brady United Against Gun Violence. You can go to the Brady website and connect with chapters, your local chapter, through that website, and we'll get you connected with advocates and efforts, at the local level on trying to reduce gun violence and death. As I said, the goal is to reduce firearm injury and death. I think there's still areas of disagreement on how we get there. I mean, where there are more guns, there are more gun deaths. That's clear. But nonetheless, I think it was a good conversation. Now that my technology issues seem to be worked out, I'm very willing to do this again.
Yeah, same here. I think we touched on some commonalities. My only disagreement with Amanda's final statement was John Lott's done a great deal of research on more guns actually equals less crime. Hence me using this, those constitutional carry states that have a lot less violent crime. But nonetheless, I think that what our work is mostly, of course, we're a Second Amendment supportive organization. But I think because we're doing so much work in urban areas, a larger portion of it that I think everyone can agree with is conflict resolution, de-escalation, political education, and firearm safety. I think anyone would be hard pressed to disagree with those things for urban America, not limited to, but more specifically in the urban environments. Anyone that wants to support that work, our classes are completely crowdsourced. Our GoFundMe, we've been on this tour, going to these areas, Chicago, New Orleans, Compton. We'll be in Compton next week. Again, a good brother named Nipsey Hussle was murdered there. He owns businesses and hip hop star and all of that stuff. So we'll be there to, support families and help people with the grieving and healing process. And if anybody wants to support that, our efforts in that area, and reducing that trauma and that ignorance around firearms, it's gofundme.com/Black Guns Matter. And they can email us at info at officialblackgunsmatter.com.
Awesome. And I'm sorry to hear about that tragedy. I want to again summarize. It's not about that we have to agree about everything. You bring your own perspective, Maj, and you, Amanda, bring your own perspective. And a lot of people have their own perspectives, and that's fine. That's perfect. I think that's how democracy flourishes, by everybody bringing their own perspective to the table, to this pool, spilling their perspective, their understanding, their meaning into this pool, and creating a common shared pool of meaning. Because I find that Pareto's law always works in every argument. 80% of the disagreement is over 20% of the details, and 80% of the issue we're perfectly in agreement about. And we tend to be so fixated about what we disagree about that we can't actually collaborate and move forward on everything that we do agree on, which is the majority. I think both sides of the debate are very sincere, mostly in wanting to reduce gun deaths, wanting to increase people's safety, wanting just everybody to feel that they have the ability to have a safe and quality life. And it's just people have different perspectives about what's the best way to reach that. And I think we can't really bridge these we can't actually move forward unless we actually have a conversation and share. And I think that really the future of America as a country depends on our ability to have these conversations with each other and just see that we're both human, we're both sides of the conversation, want the same things in the end of the day. There's just a little bit of different perspectives about what the best way to do it. And I really want to thank the both of you again from the depth of my heart. I think you guys were awesome. It was a very good roundtable, and I hope to see you both again. Have
Absolutely.
a great night.
I'm down. See y'all later.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.